In 1982, when I was in the Air Force and stationed at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, Washington, I was training to be a survival instructor, so I spent a great deal of time in the Kaniksu, Kaniksu National Forest. I've always loved the peace I feel when I'm out in nature. I've never hunted, but I did a lot of camping and fishing. While I was in training, I had to learn to set traps and field dress game and tan hides. I also learned to make jerky, and I smoked fish in a smoker that we made in camp. I know how to live out in the middle of nowhere. In 1982, my ex-husband and I drove from Spokane to the West Coast beach outside of Seattle to spend the day and have some fun. It was off-season, so we had the beach to ourselves. The drive back was long, and we started late for home. We were both exhausted, so we decided to make camp on the way back. We found a stretch of woods between the road and the river. It was pretty far back in there, but the state or county had set up a little camping area with brick grills and stone picnic tables. Because it was late in the year, it was getting chilly. No one else was around, which meant it would be quiet and peaceful. We set up our tent, we made a fire and ate dinner, and then we went to bed. And something woke me up at 2 a.m., but I didn't know what it was. I lay there listening, thinking maybe an animal of some sort was walking around the campsite. I was wide awake now, but I couldn't hear anything now. I didn't notice before we went to sleep, but now I was aware that there were no sounds of insects, birds, or any other animals. It was just too quiet. I tried to convince myself that it was because it was so cold out, and I tried to go back to sleep. And the longer I laid there, the more antsy I got. I didn't know why, but I was uncomfortable, and I was scared. It got so bad that I had to get up and see if there was anything going on outside. I climbed out of the tent, doing my best not to wake my husband. He had a way of making me feel like an idiot and laughing at me about these things. Since I was already upset, I didn't feel like I needed the extra burden of him picking at me. I sat there at the picnic table watching and listening, but I couldn't find anything wrong. Even so, this uneasy feeling I had was getting worse. After 30 minutes with nothing going on, I kicked myself in the butt for being so silly, and I crawled back in the tent. I still couldn't go back to sleep. In fact, I was growing more and more afraid. Finally, I decided to get back out. For some reason, I knew there was something out there that was dangerous and I couldn't see it. More than anything, I wanted to leave, but I was worried about waking my husband up for something that I couldn't explain. The terror built until I began to cry, even though I still didn't know why. When I couldn't take it anymore, I woke him up. And when I tried to explain what I was feeling, I was astonished to find that he didn't make fun of me or get mad. He just got up and started packing. We loaded up the car and we left without ever knowing the reason for my terror. Now, I've thought about it often over the years, and I've tried to work out why the whole thing happened. Then in 2011, I learned about the capture of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. The river we camped by was the Green River, and we could see the bridge where he dumped one of his victims from where we camped. I've often pondered what I was so afraid of that night, and could it have been something to do with him or his victims? I've never had the gift of discernment that my little sister has, nor have I ever had a supernatural experience. I don't know why I would have been so afraid of something that I couldn't see. After listening to your storytelling, I have to wonder if that uncomfortable feeling was because a Sasquatch was nearby. It seems that others have felt that way when they've had their experiences. I'll never know why. Was it a serial killer? Was it a Sasquatch, or was it just me? Gary Ridgway was caught due in part to the assistance of Ted Bundy. Bundy offered his help, and ultimately, because of his advice, they caught Ridgway. It was nearly 12 years after Bundy died, but it was by acting on Bundy's intricate knowledge and understanding of his own kind that they were eventually able to arrest and convict Ridgway. What a cool story. You think Bigfoot warned this woman that she was in the area where a serial killer was operating? That's pretty creepy. Pretty creepy. Thank you for the story, ma'am. It was very cool. Very cool story. Hey guys, welcome to another podcast. Hope you enjoyed that first story. Let's jump into a few more. My name's Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixiecryptid What If It's True podcast. You can find it on YouTube and on any podcast app by searching for What If It's True podcast. All right, I got a few more stories to do. Let's jump into it. All right, here we go. This is a Bigfoot story I really enjoyed, and I don't know who the writer is, just an email address. I grew up in a working class family in Pinhook, Virginia. If I wasn't playing sports in school, it was my job to split wood and take care of the outside chores. I was out in the woodpile chopping wood one fall evening when I heard a knock on a tree behind me. I stopped chopping and listening to figure out what it was. I only had time to listen for a few seconds before another wood knock came from the opposite direction, 200 yards away. That was followed by whoops coming from both directions. I was a teenager then, and I grew up outside. These were sounds I had never heard before. I sprinted inside and tried to explain to my parents what I'd heard, but they laughed and said it was a bear that was in the area. I knew it wasn't a bear, but there was no point in arguing with them. Those whoops and wood knocks continued throughout that winter and into the following summer. Whenever I was outside, I would hear them. I still hadn't identified them by opening day of bow season the following October. That morning, my dad woke me up and we got our gear on and we headed to the ATV. The plan was for him to drop me off at my stand and he'd go to his and sit until lunchtime. If one of us hadn't called the other to say that he'd gotten a deer by then, he would come back and pick me up. Everything was going according to plan. He dropped me off 100 yards from my stand and I snuck in, nice and quiet. I hooked my bow to the carabiner that was at the end of the rope and I climbed up into the stand. I put on my safety harness and pulled up my bow and pulled an arrow from my quiver and I nocked it. It was 30 minutes before daylight. As the sky grew lighter, I began to notice how quiet it was. There were no sounds coming from the woods at all. No crickets, no frogs from the nearby pond, no squirrels barking, and no birds. Nothing. It was dead still. It was way too still. As daylight approached, I pulled my buck grunt call from my bag and I called on it a couple of times. I heard crashing 100 yards away from my stand. This is it, I thought. I stood up quietly as I could and I drew my bow. I followed the movement as it pushed toward the clearing 60 yards to my left. I drew in my breath and I waited for a buck to step out into that clearing. Small branches cracked and crumbled as they were shoved aside. An underbrush was stepped on and trampled down, and still I waited. Finally, it cleared the tree line, but it wasn't a deer. It was a 6-foot-tall mother Sasquatch carrying a 3-foot-tall juvenile. I froze in place. I was too shocked to move. My heart was beating out of my chest as I tried to take aim, but I was trembling so hard I couldn't keep it steady. My mind could not comprehend what I was seeing. Finally, I lowered the bow and I sat down. When I did, the mother let out the loudest scream I've ever heard. It made my ears ring for an hour afterward. She rushed back into the brush and she yelled once more. I don't know how long I sat there. I was too scared to move, and before I finally reached for my phone and called my dad. He didn't answer on the first call because he kept his phone on silent when we were hunting. It felt like 10 minutes before he called me back. "Come get me now, Dad," I said. I barely got the words out. I was so scared I could hardly speak. 20 minutes passed before he showed up. I got myself and my gear down out of the tree and I ran as fast as I could to the ATV. He wanted to know what was wrong, and I tried my best to explain what happened, what I saw. You saw a bear, he told me. I'm 32 years old now, and I still feel uneasy in the woods. I hunt other properties around the area, but I can't bring myself to hunt my family's property at all. I don't much care for hunting there now anyway. Oh, what a good story. Full visual. He's sitting there hunting. He hears something crashing through the woods after he makes a call. He knows it's a big buck. He's ready to release that arrow, and a Bigfoot steps out with a baby under her arm. That is fantastic. Unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. Thank you to the writer. It's a great story. I really appreciate it. This email was written by Anita, and she claims the story is true. During the summer of 1975, about a month before my 17th birthday, I was hanging out in front of my house with my friends, Ann, Bob, and Wayne. They were all 2 or 3 years younger than me, so they were like my little brothers and sister. We're all still close to this day. Bob and Wayne had to be home by 8 p.m., so Ann and I walked them to their house. That was when kids played outside after dark without fear of strangers, and houses were left unlocked. As we walked back to my house, we were looking up, as we often did, trying to find the Big and Little Dippers and any other constellations we could identify. I looked over into the southeast and noticed something dark hovering over the park. "Hey, look at that," I said to Ann. "What is that thing?" The object was a big dark mass that wasn't making any sound at all. It had a light under it, and it was moving very slowly from side to side in a sweeping motion. And then it would go straight again before repeating the pattern over and over. We couldn't see any sky as it moved, but what freaked us out was the absence of sound. You can hear prop planes and helicopters coming even from a distance, and this object was completely silent. We watched as it moved over the trees of the road to the east of my road until it had traveled from the south to the north, always making that same side-to-side motion, followed by going straight again. I was having trouble making out the defining shape, but the size was as big as 3 or 4 baseball diamonds. The light underneath was not a spotlight. It just illuminated the underside. But we were flabbergasted, and for the life of us, we couldn't figure out what it could be. We got to the end of my street and kept following it north, and at one point, when it was directly east of us, I was able to make out that it was round. It wasn't a blimp, though. No blimp could maneuver like that. We kept watching and following until we lost it in the trees to our north. We were frustrated and ran back to my house, and I immediately called the Jacksonville International Airport tower. Nervously trying to hide the fear in my voice, I said, "Do you have any airplanes on your radar coming from Daytona or Orlando or maybe St. Augustine?" "No," he answered, "I have nothing on my radar. Why?" I quickly explained everything we had seen and where, being careful to stress just how oddly silent it had been. And in turn, he asked me where I lived and if I had family or friends in the Arlington area. I told him I had an elderly aunt and uncle there, but that was it. He then told me that he'd already received 20 calls from people who described the exact same thing. "But I have nothing on my radar, and I can't explain it," he said. Then he asked if I could give him my phone number in case he needed to contact me. "I'm not going to have any men in spacesuits show up at my door, am I?" I asked. Okay, I was a 16-year-old dorky girl, I know, but I was genuinely afraid of what would happen. He laughed and he said, "No, sweetie, nobody in spacesuits is coming to your house." That was 40 years ago, and I've never seen anything like that since. Ann and I still talk about it from time to time. It's just something we cannot explain. To add to this, as a bonus, if you will, back in 1972, my grandparents were coming home from Tennessee driving down I-75 to I-10. Their car was one of only a few on the road as the dusk fell across the sky. My grandfather was driving when he saw what looked like a plane flying very low in the distance. They were flying so low he was sure they were going to crash land on the interstate and that maybe they thought I-10 was the runway. My grandparents pulled over and waited for the inevitable crash. Bebop, as I called him, got out of the car, and the first thing that struck him was the absence of sound. As it got closer, he could tell it was triangular, but it never did make any noise. It passed over them at the treetop height and then took off straight up into the sky, and just like that, it was gone. No wind, no nothing. It shot straight up into the sky like a slingshot, he said. After that, whenever they went to Tennessee, they took a different route because my poor grandmother was afraid they would see it again if they took I-10. Thanks for reading my story, Cam. It has stayed with me for a long time and it still freaks me out a bit. I wish I knew who was piloting that aircraft. I really wish I knew why we couldn't hear it. And she signs off Anita. Anita, thank you for that story. It's fascinating. I really do appreciate it. I would love to see one of those myself. This is an email from a woman named Lily. And as you might know, it's one of my favorite names. My dog. I have a dog named Lily. I have a character that I write stories about named Lily. He has a dog named Lily. For some reason, I've always liked that name. I don't know why. But here's what she writes. 16 years ago, Steve and I blended our families. The older kids decided that camping was a great way to spend time together, so we did 2 or 3 camps a year. One with just the 6 of us for a week at East Canyon in Utah, and a long weekend here or there with another family or 2. Steve had mentioned seeing a Bigfoot near American Fork Canyon while hunting as a teen. He's never been back to that area or even hunted since. He's a former Marine and not much scares him. It was during what was to be our last week-long family camping trip to East Canyon that this story starts. We like to camp Monday through Friday. Big Rock Campground is rough, but not very easy. Most nights we would be the only occupants in the campground, and the kids loved it. On this night, halfway through our stay, the 3 older kids started commenting on some strange sounds they were hearing. One said it sounded like a hyena. Another said that we're in Utah, not Africa. Why would there be a hyena? And the other said that the yipping sound sounded like a coyote. Steve, who is usually quiet, was not even responding to the kids' conversation. As the sounds continued and the kids speculated more, Dad got up from his chair and started pacing the edge of the firelight. He began his nightly storytelling, weaving some jump scare about a clown that stalks unsuspecting campers. The sounds of the night worked seamlessly into his story. The 4 kids settled down, and they hung on his every word while I put away camp for the night and took the day's trash to the dumpster. The night wore on, and the kids and I went to bed. I knew my husband would stay up until first light, and he'd sleep until lunch. That's just how he was when we camped. During the night, I extradited myself from the mass of arms and legs, making my way to the tent door. Steve was sitting in a chair just outside the tent, rather than near the fire that he was tending to all night. I told him I was going to go to the bathroom, and I slipped on my shoes. He said, "Hey, there's a First Nation man on a horse in camp." I grabbed an activated glow stick, waved it in acknowledgement, and I trotted off. The next day after lunch, I was cleaning up any debris that had gotten away from the table during the meal, and I saw a horse's hoof print not 6 feet from our tent. I looked up at Steve, and he said, "It's time to go fishing." I sent one of our kids off to get the tackle and poles while the other kids ran to the lake. To me, he said in a low voice, "I told you." "Yeah, but I thought maybe a sheep had gotten into the camp again." "No," he said, and that was the end of it. He went off fishing, but not far. The rest of the trip, he stayed within eyesight of the camp, except for water runs to the marina. The years passed and life changed. One camping buddy died of a heart attack before the next camping season. Another moved 4 hours away for work. The children began peeling off and making their own lives, and now we have a few grandkids. We haven't been camping in over 12 years and haven't even been away from our home in 6, if you count Grandma's funeral as a vacation. Soon we will be empty nesters. Since we've never taken a vacation, just my husband and I, we decided to mark this change in life with a trip. Of course, we'll go camping. That was our first thought. I researched east to see what it had to offer these days. There is a resort at one end with condos for rent. The Dixie Creek campground now has cabins, yurts, and covered wagons available for glamping. Even a cute ad with a Bigfoot trying out one of the campground's new hammocks. Armed with options, prices, and availability, I suggested to Steve that we return to the east for our little getaway, showing him the Bigfoot hammock ad. He looked at it and said, Do you recall the night the horse came into camp, he said. You know those sounds? That's why we haven't gone back. Ignorance for me was bliss. I didn't know what I had, but it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Okay, Lily, that was pretty good. So, it wasn't a Bigfoot story. It was a Native American man walking around on a horse, leaving a track by your tent. That was pretty cool. Do you think it was like a spirit, like a spirit walker, or I don't know what you call those things. I don't know. I thought Bigfoot was going to be part of this, but I'm reading this cold. I thought it was a good story. I thought it was a real good story, but I'm a little confused on the point, like what was going on. So anyway, I thought it was great. I really appreciate her sending it. This is an email, probably the first email I've ever gotten about a skinwalker. And there's a word in here that I'm going to mispronounce, but I'm going to give it a whirl. But this is interesting. The writer doesn't give his name, and that's no problem, but here's what he writes. My brother and I enjoy a series of fiction books featuring a Chicago private eye. One day, my brother was discussing his love of the books with some co-workers when he relayed to them how the book's protagonist wizard was being stalked by a Naglushi, which is the Navajo word for skinwalker, I think. One of the women listening to him suddenly freaked out when she heard him say that word. She was so shaken by it that she nearly shouted, "Don't say that word!" My brother was shocked by her reaction. He could see the fear in her, so he went to her later and he apologized. And this is what she told him. First, she apologized for her reaction. She was a bit embarrassed, and then she explained that she was Navajo and that in her culture it was considered very bad to discuss that creature, and especially bad to say the word out loud. Saying the name was considered risky because you might draw its attention to you, and that was dangerous. Whispering the rest, she explained that he got the word wrong. It's Yenaljushi. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. She said that when she was a teenager, she and her mother were driving home very late one night near the reservation. The highway was deserted and they were in the middle of an empty southern Utah desert. Suddenly her mom slowed down. She'd seen something. A second later, she was flooring the gas and screaming, "Get down on the floor now!" Confused and not having seen what had panicked her mother, she ducked down in the back seat. But being a typical teenager, she had to see what was going on, so she poked her head up and looked out the back window. Right next to the rear window of the car was an emaciated old man with a crazy, evil look on his face. It was terrifying. Regardless of his obvious age and emaciated state, he was running at an inhuman speed, and he was gaining on them. Soon they were speeding well beyond the highway's posted speed limit, but still this thing managed to stay next to the car's rear wheel. It chased them longer than any normal human being could run at full speed. When they got home, her mother called some of the elders to come over. My brother's coworker explained that this was the I'm not going to try it. She didn't elaborate on what the elders said or did, but despite being alone and well out of earshot of any of their other coworkers, she never spoke above a whisper. her fear of the Nedlushi or the Skinwalker was real. My brother was convinced that she had definitely seen something that night, and she genuinely believed that her story was true. Oh man, I'm sorry I butchered that, not being able to pronounce that word, but even if I knew how to pronounce it, I probably couldn't. But let's quit talking about me. And what a scary story. I mean, this is a Navajo girl who had an experience with an actual skinwalker, and the man who wrote the story said there's no doubt. It kind of makes you wonder about these Native American myths and stories about the skinwalker. I've always kind of been interested in that. Maybe I should pick up a book or two and read about those. But I appreciate the writer sending it. It kind of gave me the creeps, but it was good. Thank you. Here's a Bigfoot story. We'll wind up the podcast with this one. This encounter happened just a short time ago. I was out in the national forest. I was searching for a good hunting spot for the upcoming deer season, and I parked my truck in a small stone lot and proceeded into the woods. I'm kind of a knucklehead because when I'm hunting, I don't follow man-made trails. By the way, let me tell you, this takes place in Alaska. I'll cut through the bush until I find a game trail, and then I'll try to follow it further away from civilization. Anyway, this day was no different. I walked through the woods and hit a promising-looking trail, and I took off. After 2 hours, I stopped for a break. My back was starting to hurt because I spent most of that time bent over looking for tracks. I picked a small boulder to sit against. It was warm, and I was tired, and I naturally fell asleep. I have no idea how long I was out, but a loud thrashing in the woods behind the boulder startled me awake. I've been in combat. I've learned to wake up instantly and quietly. Whatever was thrashing around behind me had to be big, and I slowly started to peep over the rock, hoping to see a huge buck tearing the crap out of a tree. But just before my head cleared the boulder, everything stopped. I froze, and everything got quiet. The kind of quiet just before the chainsaw starts in a horror movie. 2 things happened. I heard a sneeze and instinctively said, "God bless you." As soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted it, but there was an instantaneous rushing of something large through the woods. I stood up quickly and looked for the deer, and I'm sure I'd spooked it. I was surprised not to see one but 2 hairy creatures running away from me at a rapid clip. They weren't at all muscular, but they were both 6 or 7 feet tall. They had the same hair color as the male my daughter had seen earlier. They didn't stop, and I soon lost sight of them. Going around the boulder, I saw the ground torn up in an area 12 feet across, and there were footprints that measured 15 inches. My guess is that after I fell asleep, 2 juveniles had wandered into the area and decided to have themselves a wrestling match. I regret that I did not take my phone into the woods that day, because pictures of the prints in the area they tore up would at least somewhat corroborate my story. Yeah, pictures always corroborate a story, but they don't necessarily take place of the story. This was a good one. This was quite short and simple. And a man out hunting, tracking deer, falls asleep and has 2 Bigfoot wrestling in the woods just right behind him. That's amazing. That's an amazing story. Thank you, sir, for the story. Thanks for listening. I appreciate you hanging with me this far. If you thought it was pretty good, give me a thumbs up or a like or even a subscribe, and come back and listen to the next podcast. I've got over 300 podcasts already up. You can go back through my library and listen to all sorts of crazy, weird, interesting stories from top to bottom. They're all good. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you guys on the next podcast. Thank you.